Britain, January 1944. In the RAF's radar station at Dover, an operator stares at his screen in disbelief. He frantically recalibrates his equipment. They wouldn't dare. But the blip remains, a lone Me-410, penetrating airspace that's been virtually German-free for nearly 2 years. Mosquito fighters respond with a quick and decisive interception, and a dark secret floats amongst the wreckage off the coast. Among the debris, a waterlogged map of London, meticulously marked with strange targets, each bearing the name of German cities: Berlin, Hamburg, Hannover. For 2 years, Londoners have slept without the wail of air raid sirens. For 2 years, they've rebuilt their shattered city. But now, across the channel, Hitler has given a startling order. Something big is coming. The Blitz. In the autumn of 1940, after failing to break the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe shifted to a new and much more vile strategy: the sustained bombing of British cities. Nearly 350 German bombers, escorted by over 600 fighters, struck London in broad daylight, followed by even more bombing under the cover of night. From one moment to the next, factories, rail lines, docks, and civilian neighborhoods all became part of the war. The Luftwaffe returned again and again, striking for nearly 60 consecutive days. Though the German High Command called the campaign Operation Loga, in Britain, the name that stuck was shorter, more complicated, and far more personal. They called it the Blitz. Over the course of 9 long months, the Blitz attacks took the souls of more than 40,000 people across the United Kingdom and left up to 2 million homeless. The raids reached a horrific climax on December 29, 1940, when over 100,000 incendiaries fell on central London, sending fire tearing through the historic heart of the capital. Then, in May 1941, just as suddenly as it had begun, the bombing stopped. From then on, Hitler shifted his attention east, preparing the Wehrmacht for war with the Soviet Union, reassigning German bomber units elsewhere, leaving only sporadic night raids over British skies. What followed became known as the lull, a stretch of quiet lasting more than 2 years. As the nation no longer burned, citizens in Birmingham, Coventry, Liverpool, and more began to recover. Then, the Allies seized the initiative. Taking off from English airfields, British and American bombers launched a growing campaign into Germany. What began as isolated raids soon became a constant cycle, with the Royal Air Force striking by night and the United States Army Air Forces by day, targeting cities like Frankfurt, Kassel, and Hanover, as well as key industrial hubs such as Essen, Düsseldorf, and Cologne. But Hamburg was hit the hardest when, during the summer of 1943, the city burned for days on end due to under-coordinated attacks that tore through homes, shipyards, and entire districts. Even Berlin, once thought too far east to strike regularly, came under sustained attack. By year's end, with the Allies entirely in control of the skies, German civilians were spending more nights in basements than in beds. Though the Reich's propaganda machine pushed harder than ever, inside the Reich, pressure was building to strike back. Unternehmen Steinbock. Inside the Luftwaffe, the strain was starting to show. The branch's once confident leader, Hermann Göring, the proud architect of some of Germany's most significant victories in France, the Balkans, and the opening months of Barbarossa, had grown erratic, issuing contradictory orders and interfering with operations, and when they inevitably failed, blamed absolutely everyone but him. Senior officers like Erhard Milch, Inspector General of the Air Force, and Adolf Galland, head of the fighter arm, had once followed Göring without hesitation. Now, they saw the truth clearly. The man who had once promised control of the skies could no longer even protect his own cities. Across staff meetings and internal memos, High Command urged a full-scale pivot to defense, diverting aircraft, pilots, and radar units back to the Reich, even if it meant stripping support from the Eastern Front. But Hitler refused to accept that the war had turned, and he dismissed every single proposal outright. On December 3rd, Göring summoned General Major Dietrich Peltz, a highly decorated Stuka ace and one of the Luftwaffe's most seasoned bomber tacticians, feared by Allied ground forces from France to the Eastern Front, and gave him a new assignment: organize Unternehmen Steinbock, or Operation Capricorn, one last major bombing campaign with the objective of, quote, avenging terror attacks of the enemy. That same day, Peltz rushed to assemble what he could, pulling heavy bombers from all across occupied Europe, gathering no less than 500 aircraft. The main force for Operation Capricorn was made up of medium bombers like the Junkers Ju-88 and the Dornier Do-217, supported by the more modern Ju-188, which, despite being the backbone of the Luftwaffe's bombing campaigns earlier in the war, by early 1944, they were beginning to show their age. For secondary roles, the Luftwaffe had a couple dozen Me-410s and a mix of FW-190s and Bf-109s in fighter-bomber configurations. The final asset in their arsenal was the Hinkel He-177A, Germany's only actual long-range heavy bomber, about to be deployed in meaningful numbers for the first time in the conflict. A significant project years in the making, though impressive on paper, this aircraft was meant to carry massive payloads deep into enemy territory. In reality, it was plagued by persistent engine fires and mechanical failures, mainly because of its overly ambitious twin-engine layout, making maintenance a nightmare and fires a constant risk. Coordinating the entire offensive was General Field Marshal Hugo Sperry, leader of Luftflotte 3. Under Goering's orders, bombers carried a mixed load, mostly incendiaries, with a smaller share of high explosives, including 2,200-pound bombs and sea mines. Pathfinders were assigned to mark targets using electronic navigation aids, while radar jammers and chaff were deployed to confuse British defenses. To further reduce vulnerability on the ground and mislead potential intruders, the bombers would be dispersed across numerous airfields and parked in revetments, while dummy runways and decoy facilities were also constructed to mislead RAF intruders. As Peltz finalized details for Operation Capricorn, what he and most of the Luftwaffe refused to admit was that in the 2.5 years since the Blitz had ended, Britain had turned its night skies into something far more dangerous than before. Readier than ever. By early 1944, the Royal Air Force was no longer the desperate, reactive network of 1940. Instead, opposing the German attacks and defending British airspace was a modern and efficient night fighting force. The RAF's Fighter Command Night Fighter Network had grown into a well-drilled force, with 13 squadrons of the de Havilland Mosquitoes, fast twin-engine interceptors armed with cannons, machine guns, and advanced airborne radar. 3 more squadrons flew similarly armed Bristol Beaufighter 6Fs. All were being flown by veteran crews, disciplined, practiced, and well familiarized with the tactics needed to bring down enemy bombers at night. Supporting them was a mighty wall of firepower from Anti-Aircraft Command. More than 2,700 guns now ringed key areas like London, a large increase of over 30% from the year before. Now, these guns were radar-guided, capable of tracking targets through clouds, darkness, or rain. And there was another powerful weapon the Germans couldn't see: Ultra. Thanks to decrypted Enigma transmissions, as the Luftwaffe finalized details in secret, the RAF already had whispers of an incoming attack. Though Operation Capricorn was meant to begin over the Christmas period of 1943, weather and disorganization bought the Luftwaffe a few more weeks. Before the main offensive even began, scattered raids pushed across the Channel under moonless skies. Beginning on January 2nd, 1944, and through the 15th, groups of Me-410s, FW-190s, and Ju-188s struck targets in London, Kent, and the Midlands, all with light bomb loads and poor accuracy. Every time, Mosquito crews scrambled rapidly across the sector, quickly intercepting the intruders as they neared the coast. That first night, Wing Commander John Cat's Eyes Cunningham, one of the highest-scoring night fighter aces in the service, was airborne on his Mosquito, flying alongside Flight Lieutenant Jimmy Rawnsley, his longtime radar operator. While high above the skies at 12,000 feet over the Thames estuary, Rawnsley caught a target approaching from the east, closing fast at a low altitude. As Cunningham eased the throttle forward, the enemy suddenly became visible. It was the pale shape of an incoming Me-410. Lining up against it, Ace Cunningham sent a short burst from his 20mm cannons, making the Me-410 rock violently, catch fire, and begin to descend in a slow, disjointed spiral. For a while, the pilot and his wingman watched it until the enemy disappeared into the dark, officially marking the pilot's 20th victory. By mid-January, Allied codebreakers confirmed the truth. the Luftwaffe was assembling a full-scale bomber force in Western Europe. By now, unlike all those years before, Ultra had the targets, the units, the routes, and even the schedule. This time, Britain was prepared. The opening act. On January 21st, 1944, an unusually cold night fell over England, just as the Luftwaffe finalized details for the first full-blown attack of Operation Capricorn. Just 24 hours earlier, nearly 800 British bombers had torn through Berlin's streets and rail yards, destroying nearly everything in sight. Now it was London's turn. For this operation, codenamed Unternehmen Mars, General Major Dietrich Peltz assembled 230 aircraft across 14 different airfields and drove personally to Chateau d'Un, the forward operating base for the Henkel HU-177s, about to debut in a deep penetration mission. Inside the building, he briefed wing commanders Oberst Ruprecht Hayne and Oberst Lieutenant Bernhard Joop on the attack. On the maps at briefing tables, targets across the British capital were assigned codenames borrowed from German cities already reduced to rubble, like Berlin, Hamburg, and Hannover, reminders not only of what had been lost, but what was about to be repaid. At 7:30 p.m., the first wave lifted into the darkening sky, carrying 500 tons of bombs and incendiaries. Pathfinders led the formation, ready to mark London with beacons, marking the path for the bombers that followed. But just as the aircraft crossed the channel, British radar operators tracked nearly 100 of these aircraft in their approach, spread in a cone-shaped formation between the Sussex and Essex coasts. Despite releasing chaff, thin strips of foil meant to confuse British radar, their plan quickly went south. In addition to strong westerly winds gusting over 60 miles per hour, which blew the formations off course, British jamming messed with their instruments, leading most crews to rely on dead reckoning. Out of the more than 200 models that took off from Germany, only 15 bombers actually reached the capital. The few models began their bombing runs from 16,000 feet, dropping 30 tons of bombs within the city, a very small fraction of what was expected. The cost for this minimal damage was severe for the Germans, and by night's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 18 aircraft, 6 HU-177s, 9 Ju-88s, 3 Ju-188s, and individual Do-217 and FW-190 aircraft. The second wave, launched in the early hours of the following day, fared no better. The weather became even worse, forcing greater reliance on electronic navigation aids, all easily disrupted by British countermeasures. The damage assessment confirmed minimal damage. Of the 268 tons of bombs dropped, only 32 fell on London. Only a couple dozen casualties and several damaged facilities, including a small strike in the Palace of Westminster. It was the Vickers Armstrong factory that suffered the most significant damage, losing 2 days of production. A week later, Peltz renewed the offensive with 11 bomber groups. But once again, only a little over a dozen bombers caused their targets. Despite the massive failure, Peltz was willing to keep the attacks going for months. Scattered in the night. London was merely 100 miles from German ground control stations, yet Luftwaffe bombers consistently missed their targets. Meanwhile, British bombers struck German towns with remarkable precision from distances exceeding 600 miles, even during severe weather conditions. Hitler, as expected, was furious with the disappointing results from the first month of the Capricorn attacks. Though Peltz pointed out to the Führer that his crews were barely out of flight school and the Luftwaffe lacked advanced navigation tools, the leader refused to listen. Early February brought even more failure. On February 3rd, a mixed-bag group of Me-410s and FW-190s thundered across the channel at 7,000 feet, navigational lights blacked out, the only light coming from their instrument panels. As they approached London, the crews released their bombs, the payload's orange explosions momentarily illuminating the clouds. Though German radio trumpeted victory, the truth was humiliating. Despite the pilots wholeheartedly believing they flew over London, in reality, most bombs fell on the rural outskirts of the capital, all miles away from their targets. By morning, 15 bombers had vanished, and most of their crews were never heard from again. 10 days later, Dietrich Peltz paced the frozen tarmac at Chateau d'Un, his breath visible in the winter air. 6 weeks into Capricorn, he had absolutely nothing to show for it other than scattered bombs, vanishing crews, and Hitler's mounting fury. Inside a hangar, he found exhausted airmen with gaunt faces, all terrified their fates would be the same as their fallen comrades. Peltz addressed them with forced confidence, downplaying British defenses to boost morale. On the night of the 13th, Peltz received word that once again, his bombers failed to reach any significant targets. Alone in his quarters, the leader once again studied the maps and reports spread across his desk. German bomber crews were either missing their targets entirely or dropping their payloads early, spooked by London's imposing anti-aircraft defenses. His inexperienced pilots, replacements for the veterans now lost or captured, simply lacked the nerve to push through to their targets. Without any other choice in his hands, Peltz made a decision. He would commit everything to the next attack, focusing on central London with the largest concentration of bombers yet. A win at last. On February 18, 1944, after weeks of disappointment, another Luftwaffe bomber stream approached London from multiple directions, engines muffled by cloud cover. British radar operators tracked approximately 175 aircraft as they crossed the channel, but this time the bombers flew with newfound accuracy, all concentrated on their target. In the middle of the night, high explosives smashed into military targets, hitting the RAF Earl's Colne base and even the American airfields at Willingale. However, it was the London assault that was the most destructive single attack since the height of the Blitz in 1941. All over the capital, incendiaries cascaded down, piercing rooftops and igniting 480 fires across the city, hitting buildings, public transportation stations, water mains, and homes alike. But it was the western districts that suffered the most and worst. The Fulham neighborhood was subjected to 20,000 incendiary bombs, while at Hammersmith, massive SC-1800 Hermann 2,000-pound bombs flattened entire blocks with no mercy. Even 4 500-pound bombs struck Westminster's government quarter, one of them damaging the Treasury building at 10 Downing Street. By dawn, the horrific toll became clear. In addition to hundreds of casualties, over 2,500 properties lay damaged or destroyed. 2 nights later, Peltz launched a follow-up strike. On the night of the 21st, 165 aircraft assembled over the Dutch coast, then streaked toward the Thames estuary. For this attack, the German crews adopted area bombing techniques, mimicking the RAF's own tactics against their own cities. The result was over 600 fires across London, and the mix of incendiaries and high-explosive bombs hammered historic buildings, offices, schools, and businesses. On February 24th, Westminster became the target. Flying under the guidance of Luftwaffe 7 bomb sites, German bombs caused more than 200 fires to light up London's historic heart. That same night, an errant bomb slammed down mere yards from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, a near miss that, had fate allowed a slight shift in trajectory, might have cut off the coming invasion of Europe entirely. For 6 consecutive nights, London skies blazed as German bombers returned again and again, finally achieving Hitler's objective of bringing genuine destruction to the British capital. Yet, even in its moment of greatest success, the Luftwaffe was bleeding to aircraft in the skies over England, the prowling mosquitoes hunting down their prey relentlessly. As the month ended, though Peltz had achieved his most significant success, the question on everyone's mind was if he could sustain it into March. The Last Stand. As March dawned, the Luftwaffe's propaganda machine continued to trumpet imaginary victories, while reality told a different story. Goering claimed 164 crews struck London on March 2nd with incredible and never-before-seen accuracy. However, the truth was that barely 70 aircraft even managed to take off, and by then, the once proud HE-177 force had dwindled to just 15 operational heavy bombers. That night, the remaining HE-177s carried one of the heaviest payloads of the campaign, each loaded with 4 massive SC-1000 bombs aimed at Victoria Station. But the crews, filled with paranoia of Allied spying, distrusted their own radio beacons, and instead chose to navigate using the flash of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire to find their targets. Though the bombs found targets, damaging the Royal Arsenal and Siemens factory, the cost was unsustainable. 8 more irreplaceable aircraft vanished into the night. One Ju-88 from KG-6 spiraled down in flames, leaving only a smoking crater in an English field. As the month went on, the massive Allied Big Week bombing campaign began, and hundreds of American bombers began striking German factories by day, only to be relieved by the RAF at night. By mid-March, pelts turned to deception. While FW-190 fighter bombers staged a diversionary attack against Plymouth, the main force targeted Whitehall and Buckingham Palace. However, British radar operators quickly spotted the ruse, and despite reaching London, bombs scattered wildly, causing hundreds of small fires but missing their high-value targets, costing them nearly 20 aircraft in return. As losses mounted, pelts pivoted away from London and launched an attack on Bristol in the latter part of the month, yet not a single bomb fell on the city. In fact, the attack was so inaccurate the residents remained asleep, all entirely unaware they'd been targeted, while bombs scattered harmlessly across the countryside. As March ended, the brutal truth was unavoidable. The campaign that Hitler had demanded as revenge for Allied bombing was instead revealing Germany's growing impotence in the air war. Though the Luftwaffe had named their Operation Steinbock, the British had a much more comical name for it: the Baby Blitz. In a final attempt to shift the momentum, pelts seized on new intelligence in late April. A British battleship, likely one of the King George V class, was reportedly anchored in Plymouth Harbor. If destroyed, sinking a major ship might justify the entire campaign. On April 29th, a squadron of bombers was dispatched from southern France, each loaded with Fritz 10 guided bombs, the same weapon that damaged the Italian battleship Roma the year before. However, with the harbor hidden beneath thick mist and a British smokescreen also blurring the target, what was meant as a precise strike collapsed into confusion. All bombs fell blind, and the battleship was untouched. In the midst of the melee, the lead bomber, flown by Hauptmann Herbert Pfeffer, one of the Luftwaffe's most capable unit leaders, was lost with his entire crew. The beginning of the end. By the first days of May, Operation Steinbock had lost any sense of momentum. Just a handful of German bombers crossed into British airspace in the first half of the month, each one tracked and intercepted, some vanishing into the night without hitting anything at all. What replaced them were mostly inexperienced crews, young, hastily trained pilots now flying missions their predecessors hadn't survived. Morale inside the Gruppen was at its lowest point, and maintenance officers struggled to keep engines running. Some airfields were nearly silent. For the first 2 weeks of May, the campaign simply wound down, and only a single Staffel or squadron was airworthy. Others were rotated or rested entirely. The strategy changed too. Incendiaries were dropped from the loadouts. Crews were told to ignore fire markers on the ground. New targets were assigned. In Britain, the atmosphere was very different. Civilian casualties had dropped sharply. The people no longer rushed to shelters at the sound of sirens. Many slept through the warnings entirely. The Mosquito squadrons were flying with complete confidence. Still, there was one more attempt. On the night of May 14th, German planners selected Bristol, the city that had until now escaped major damage. This time, there would be no incendiaries, and crews were ordered to focus only on high explosives and to ignore the fires below, warning them the British had littered the landscape with decoys. The Luftwaffe committed 4 Gruppen to the strike, a final attempt to deliver a meaningful blow. Around 150 bombers assembled and crossed the Channel under carefully plotted routes toward Bristol, a city that had mainly remained untouched. But most never even found it. Some scattered their bombs over Portsmouth and Southampton. Others saw nothing at all. 11 aircraft were lost, 4 to night fighters. The rest vanished into the dark. British radar tracked only a third of them, while the rest slipped through. With this minimal damage in the final mission, Steinbock came to its quiet end. In a total of 19 raids, the largest commitment of Luftwaffe bombers against Britain since 1941, the Baby Blitz cost Germany an outstanding 329 bombers, along with hundreds of trained aircrew, many of whom had survived the war's early campaigns, only to be thrown into this. Nearly 2/3 of the aircraft committed to Steinbock were gone, a rate of attrition the Luftwaffe could not replace. The campaign ended not because it had succeeded, but because there was nothing left to send, leaving Germany with a far greater problem. When the Normandy landings began on June 6th, as thousands of valiant Allied troops pushed off the beaches of Normandy, the German bomber force, once the pride of the Reich, was nowhere to be found.